headbangers, heartthrobs, hair, and horror. This is 1984 through the blood-stained lens of Ryan Murphy and Brad Falchuk. The 9th season of American Horror Story takes viewers on a fun and nostalgic ride back to the 1980s, a decade brimming with neon fashion, unforgettable pop culture, and the birth of the iconic slasher film. If you don't already know, I do have an entire series, the terrifying inspiration behind American Horror Story, and I'll link a playlist to that at the end of this video. But to quickly clarify, I'm not going into a lot of details about the series. My videos, as the name of the series suggests, focus more on the inspiration for each season. In this video, we'll explore how the decade's pop culture shaped the season, from music and fashion to the booming arcade scene. But we'll also dive deep into the darker side of the 80s, the rise of high-profile crimes, the terror of serial killers like Richard Ramirez, and how real-world fears found their way into the fictional slasher films of the time. Trust me, by the end of this deep dive, you'll have a new understanding of how the 1984 season of American Horror Story connects to both the fun and the horror of the decade. Let's start with what made the 80s fun: the music, the fashion, and the rise of new media. In the early 1980s, personal computers and video games became a staple of teenage life. Arcades popped up everywhere, becoming social hubs where kids could spend hours feeding quarters into machines like Pac-Man or Donkey Kong. These arcades weren't just places to play video games. They were gathering spots, fueling a sense of community for teens. This is the environment that many characters of this season would have grown up in. But beyond the arcades and computers, music was arguably the biggest cultural force. The 1980s music scene was revolutionized by the launch of MTV in 1981. This was the first time music and visuals became inseparable, and it changed everything. Music videos weren't just promotional tools, they became cultural moments. Madonna, Michael Jackson, and Prince weren't just musicians. They were fashion icons, trendsetters who used music videos to define their personas and set the cultural tone of the decade. There was surprisingly no Madonna in this season's soundtrack, which is crazy. I know, maybe I made a mistake, but I triple checked this. But the season does feature some of the decade's most iconic songs like Cruel Summer by Bananarama, Billy Idol's Rebel Yell, of course Too Shy by Kaja Gugu. The show really does a great job bringing the eclectic and energetic music of the 80s to life. Madonna's influence, in particular, is all over 1984. The character of Montana Duke is a clear nod to Madonna's Like a Virgin era, with her edgy, rebellious attitude and distinct fashion choices. Montana epitomized the 80s, a time when neon leotards, leg warmers, and bold makeup were all the rage. This style was emblematic of the aerobics craze, started by fashion icons like Jane Fonda, who made working out a cultural event in itself. Montana's look perfectly captures the fitness-obsessed side of the 1980s, where health clubs and leotard-clad aerobics classes were all the rage. The fashion of the 1980s was also quite eclectic and colorful. Bright colors, daring patterns, and oversized silhouettes were everywhere. Fashion experts say this shift was due to a mix of economic optimism and a very strong desire for self-expression. Brands such as Calvin Klein and Ralph Lauren set the trends, but every group had their own twist on these trends. You had the preps, jocks, punks. In AHS 1984, the character styles very much reflect this, making the show feel like a true blast from the past, even if you are just looking at the clothing. This season's wardrobe choices reflect the different fashion groups that dominated the decade. Brooke Thompson wore pastel, high-waisted shorts, crop tops, and sneakers, a perfect representation of the preppy girl next door look. On the other hand, Montana Duke's style embodies the edgier side of the 80s, very Madonna-esque, as I mentioned. Meanwhile, Chet Clancy is your quintessential jock, rocking muscle tees and varsity jackets, a nod to the 80s sports fashion that was everywhere. Xavier and Trevor are prime examples of the 80s obsession with fitness and the sort of beefcake look. Xavier's style is colorful, very jazzercise dream with neon tank tops, short shorts, and headbands. Trevor's look is more so reminiscent of Tom Selleck's iconic open shirt style from Magnum PI. He also has plenty of short shorts and tank tops and likes to show off his physique, but it's definitely more beachy rather than jazzercise. Ray's style is definitely the most casual, the most relaxed this season. It straddles the line between the sporty style and the preppy style of the 80s. His wardrobe reminds me more of Ralph Lauren and Levi's, designers that focused on casual, timeless pieces. Then there's Margaret Booth, a gaudy, tacky queen, a gal after my own heart, at least once she's out of her Girl Scouts uniform later in the season. Margaret is all about embracing the bold and colorful side of the 80s. She wears vivid reds and blues with bold patterns. She's also got the big hair, very reminiscent of Joan Collins from Dynasty. Later in the season, as I mentioned, when she gets out of her Girl Scouts uniform, her fashion reflects the power dressing trend at the time, where women wore structured, statement-making outfits that showed off both confidence and authority. Margaret's all about making a bold impression, with her clothes and hair being as loud as her ambitions. Donna, aka Nurse Rita's style, starts to really shine when she sheds that nurse persona. She dips her toe in many 80s fashion ponds, but each one of those ponds is very, very loud. So if she's dipping into the preppy pond, she's going to do so with bright colors. If she's dipping her toe into the power dressing trend, she's going to go for bold prints. And when she dips her toe in what I refer to as the MTV fashion pond, she finds a way to amplify that already pretty amplified style. Even the background characters wore very period-appropriate clothing, from acid-washed jeans to oversized sweaters and off-the-shoulder tops and miniskirts. Despite the colorful facade, the 80s had its share of social issues. This decade saw the rise of the AIDS epidemic, increasing crime rates and economic challenges. The decade saw a dramatic rise in violent crime. The U.S. homicide rate, for example, peaked in 1980 at around 10.2 murders per 100,000 people, and that's according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, and this number was significantly higher than in previous decades, particularly in urban areas. And this fear infiltrated the daily lives of ordinary Americans. It wasn't just the threat of random crime that loomed large, it was the rise of high-profile crimes, especially those involving serial killers. Violent crime in general rose throughout the decade, with reports of assault, robbery, and sexual violence all seeing notable increases. Major cities like New York, LA, and Chicago became hotbeds for violent crime, driven by factors like economic instability, the crack cocaine epidemic, and urban decay. At the same time, new advancements in national media meant people were hearing about these crimes in ways they never had before. The rise of 24-hour news channels like CNN, which launched in 1980, made crime stories a central feature of everyday news. Suddenly, what might have been a local tragedy became a national headline, with shocking details broadcast into homes across the country. This constant media coverage of violence helped create a heightened sense of danger, even in places where crime rates weren't as high. People were becoming more aware of crime, not just because it was happening more, but because the media was now inescapable. This was the era when names like Ted Bundy and John Wayne Gacy became infamous. High-profile cases grabbed the nation's attention, often drawing more media coverage than political or social issues. One of the most infamous criminals to emerge from this period was Richard Ramirez, also known as the Night Stalker. Richard Ramirez's name still sends chills down the spines of those who remember his reign of terror in California. His crimes were a grotesque cocktail of home invasions, sexual assaults, and brutal murders, all carried out with a disturbing randomness that made him even more terrifying. Born Ricardo Leyva Munoz Ramirez on February 29, 1960 in El Paso, Texas, his early life was marred by a very tumultuous family environment and exposure to violence and substance abuse. His father, Julian Ramirez, a former police officer turned laborer, physically abused his children very, very often. Ramirez's upbringing was further destabilized by his older cousin Miguel, a Vietnam War veteran who introduced the young boy to graphic violence and gruesome war stories, eventually showing him pictures of his victims. This macabre influence profoundly impacted Ramirez, laying the groundwork for his future atrocities. From 1984 to 1985, Ramirez terrorized the LA and San Francisco areas, attacking his victims, both men and women, while they slept, making it clear that no one was truly safe, even in their own homes. Ramirez's killing spree officially began in June 1984 with the murder of 79-year-old Jenny Vincow. What followed was a series of increasingly vicious attacks, where Ramirez would break into homes, often through unlocked windows, and assault or murder the occupants in horrific ways. He didn't have a specific method, which made him even harder to track. Sometimes he used knives, other times guns, and he would often sexually assault his female victims. Many believe what made Ramirez so disturbing was his embrace of Satanism. He left behind pentagrams at multiple crime scenes and would sometimes force his victims to swear to Satan during his attacks. His gaunt, disheveled appearance, combined with his erratic courtroom behavior, shouting "Hail Satan" during his trial, cemented his image as one of America's most terrifying killers. The hunt for Ramirez intensified as his attacks grew more brazen and more frequent. The Los Angeles Police Department, as well as the San Francisco Police Department, worked tirelessly to track him down. A crucial breakthrough came when a survivor of one of his attacks provided a very detailed description, leading to the creation of a composite sketch. Additionally, a fingerprint they lifted off of a car he stole and then abandoned linked him to the crimes, thanks to advancements in forensic technology. Public fear turned into collective vigilance, and Ramirez's reign of terror finally ended on August 31st, 1985, when he was apprehended by an angry mob in East Los Angeles after being recognized from a newspaper photograph. His trial became a media sensation, and in 1989, he was convicted of 13 counts of murder, among other charges, and sentenced to death. Ramirez remained on death row until his death from complications related to lymphoma in 2013. The legacy of Richard Ramirez is one of horror and infamy. His crimes inspired books, films, documentaries, TV shows like American Horror Story 1984. And I just have to say, the show did a good job at capturing his chilling persona, but where they lost me was when they tried to portray him as some sort of like sexy unhinged weirdo. I felt like they were trying to portray him as like James Dean from Heathers.
Not a rebel. You're fucking psychotic.
You say tomato, I say tomato.
And this was ridiculous for numerous reasons. Number one, and the most obvious, sexualizing and or glamorizing a serial killer is never not fucking weird. It's weird. I will die on that hill. And please don't misunderstand me. Being fascinated by serial killers or true crime is not the same as glamorizing or sexualizing serial killers. I think many people who are very into true crime get understandably defensive when someone's like, ew, glamorizing true crime is so weird. If you are someone who thoroughly enjoys true crime, you're not the problem. On the flip side, if you are someone that has like a John Wayne Gacy tattoo, or you think of Jeffrey Dahmer as some sort of sex symbol, with all the respect in the world, you need to go to therapy and reevaluate all of your life choices. To further clarify, it is totally fine, okay, normal to recognize and observe that a serial killer is attractive and understand how that added to their crime. But there's a really bold line there. Writing fan fiction about a serial killer and understanding how a serial killer lured and manipulated their victims because of their attractiveness, two very different things. And going back to the Night Stalker specifically, I give you my second point. Richard Ramirez was originally known as the bad breath killer. And we're not talking a little morning breath. No. We're talking bad, swamp ass breath. Like so bad, it was part of the reason he was caught. So trying to portray Richard Ramirez as some sort of hottie when he is very clearly hideous inside and out is absolute baloney to me. I love Ryan Murphy and Brad Falchuk. They are creative and wonderful and excellent at their jobs, but who decided that this man right here was going to be the one to inspire the character that Montana Duke was slobbering over? I just can't process it. The impact of Ramirez's crimes on everyday citizens in the 80s was profound. His random attacks shattered that sense of safety that the community felt, especially in Los Angeles. But keep in mind, this was and is an extremely high-profile case. It was national news, so that fear spread everywhere. People became much more cautious, with heightened awareness and increased security measures becoming commonplace. The fear instilled by his actions, as well as many other high-profile cases in the country, ironically also had a desensitizing effect. I know that sounds totally contradictory, but it contributed to a society that was more exposed to violence and horror. This desensitization bled into the entertainment industry, and no genre reflected this cultural shift more than the slasher film. Slasher films as we know them exploded in popularity during the late 70s and reached their peak in the 80s. But what exactly is a slasher film? At its core, a slasher is a subgenre of horror that involves a masked or mysterious killer who stalks and murders a group of victims, usually teenagers or young adults, with increasing brutality. These films often follow a predictable formula. A group of unsuspecting people in an isolated location are picked off one by the killer until only the final girl remains. And the final girl is typically a female protagonist who outsmarts or overcomes the killer in the end. The popularity of slasher films in the 80s can be attributed to several factors. As I mentioned, they tapped into that cultural anxiety of the time, but also tapped into a growing fascination with violence. Also, the economic boom and technological advancements made filmmaking more accessible, leading to a surge in horror film production. The 80s were the golden age of slasher films. Titles like Friday the 13th, A Nightmare on Elm Street, The Burning, and Sleepaway Camp became massive hits, capitalizing on the public's hunger for blood, guts, and jump scares. These films were often low budget but raked in huge profits, leading to an explosion of sequels and imitators. At the same time, they reflected the growing desensitization to violence in society. As real-world crime rates surged and serial killers dominated the headlines, audiences flocked to theaters to experience a controlled version of that terror, a fictional world where the killer could be stopped, or at least confronted. Slasher films offered an almost cathartic release. The violence was extreme, but it was also contained within the safe framework of a movie. People could scream and cover their eyes, but at the end of the day, it was all just entertainment. These films were a way for audiences to confront their fears of random violence, which was seemingly happening in their real world, left, right, and center, without actually facing it. These films catered to a growing appetite for explicit and visceral entertainment, reflecting a societal shift towards accepting and even seeking out extreme depictions of violence and horror. The history of slasher films dates back to early influences like Psycho, Black Christmas, and Blood Feast. But before there were slashers, there was giallo. The giallo subgenre is like a feverish, stylish mystery thriller that carved a very distinct path in horror cinema. In Italian, giallo is a term that covers a wide range of crime and mystery stories, from detective plots and murder mysteries to horror thrillers. The word actually means yellow and comes from a popular book series published in 1929, which had striking yellow covers. These books were so iconic that giallo became the go-to word in Italian for anything mystery related, and even today people use it to talk about anything strange or unsolved. When it comes to movies, giallo takes on a unique style. For Italian audiences, it means any murder mystery or horror thriller, regardless of where it's made. But what sets classic giallo films apart, especially from the 1960s and 70s, is their distinctive mix of mystery, horror, and sexuality. These films often weave in sensual, stylized imagery, blending allure with suspense in a way that's both captivating and unsettling. So giallo movies aren't just about solving crimes, they play on the edge between attraction and fear, giving the genre a bold and provocative flair. These films are known for their vivid, almost lurid visual style, mixing crime with psychological suspense. Giallo movies often follow a whodunit format, with the masked killer stalking their prey in a way that's both eerie and elaborate. The genre became synonymous with striking cinematography, vibrant colors, and very wild, sometimes downright improbable murder sequences. But in my opinion, that's what makes giallo really fun. Directors focused heavily on the visual atmosphere, using camera angles, bold lighting, and editing techniques to create an unsettling, dreamlike mood. All of this made the subgenre hypnotic and intriguing, and in turn, giallo films paved the way for something new in the following decades. The killer, often donning black gloves, would pursue victims in intimate cat-and-mouse chases. The mystery was half the thrill, keeping audiences hooked on the tension of unveiling the killer's identity. Many of these movies focused on themes of obsession, fractured identities, and psychological trauma. These themes, combined with the intense visuals, really struck a nerve with audiences and left a lasting impression on future horror directors who were ready to push the boundaries in their own work. In the 80s, the influence of giallo becomes very noticeable. Filmmakers took the eerie atmosphere, the shadowy veiled killers, and distinct style of violence from giallo and amplified it. The concept of a single, iconic killer who embodies fear, mystery, and brutality began to take shape. Giallo-inspired techniques like suspenseful POV shots where the audience becomes aligned with the killer's gaze were further developed and became a staple in horror. These films distilled the essence of giallo into something even more visceral, focusing on the thrill of the chase and cathartic release of terror. Giallo is a genre that didn't just influence horror, it reshaped what horror could be. And without giallo films, I believe we would never have the slashers of the 80s. One slasher film that took the essence of giallo's suspense, style, and chilling POV shots and transformed them into something even more menacing was Halloween. Halloween drew on giallo's masked killer archetype and stripped it down to a raw, unsettling simplicity, creating a new, iconic figure of fear. The focus shifted from complex mysteries to primal, lingering dread, tapping into the unease of suburban safety and turning the familiar into something dangerous. Halloween, of course, was not the first slasher film to ever be made, but I would argue that it's one of the most influential slashers. And I'm going to talk about the other influential slashers too, but I'm going to start with Halloween. It was released in 1978 and tells the story of Laurie Strode, a high school student in the quiet town of Haddonfield, Illinois, who finds herself stalked by the masked killer Michael Myers. After escaping from a mental institution where he was held for the murder of his sister 15 years earlier, Michael returns to Haddonfield with one purpose: to hunt. As he stalks Laurie and her friends through the suburban streets, the film builds an unnerving tension and balances suspense and terror in a way that's become legendary in horror cinema. Halloween isn't just iconic, it's revolutionary. John Carpenter, inspired by Hitchcock's thrillers and other classic horror films, stripped down the genre to its bare essentials. He set aside elaborate backstories and gratuitous gore, instead honing in on atmosphere, suspense, and the power of anticipation. Carpenter wanted viewers to feel dread creeping through the suburbs, and his simple yet chilling synthesizer score elevated that dread to something unforgettable. Halloween created a template for a new breed of slasher films, showing that the quiet moments could be as terrifying as the chaos. Michael Myers himself stands out as a villain beyond compare. With his empty expression and complete silence, he doesn't need motives or anger to be terrifying. And I declare right now that Michael is not Laurie's brother. I don't care what anyone says. That has nothing to do with Michael Myers' purpose. Carpenter envisioned Michael as the Shape, a blank embodiment of evil who acts without reason or emotion. I love Halloween, but maybe unpopular opinion here, the sister shit is very stupid. Anyways, Michael's lack of personality gave him an inhuman quality, transforming him into a figure that feels unstoppable and almost mythic. His cold, detached presence makes him both horrifying and strangely mesmerizing, an image that has haunted horror fans ever since. Halloween also popularized the final girl. The term was coined to describe the trend where one woman outlasts her friends, using her wits and resilience to ultimately confront the villain. Halloween had it all: the final girl, the masked, symbolic, almost otherworldly killer, the chase sequences, focusing on suspense over gore and grounding horror in the safety of suburban streets, proving that horror didn't need to be over the top to be effective. It just needed to tap into those deep-seated fears that linger long after the credits roll. Both Mr. Jingles and Michael Myers share the archetype of the relentless masked killer, driven by past trauma to return to a location of previous violence. For Michael, it's the suburban streets of Haddonfield, while Mr. Jingles returns to Camp Redwood, seeking revenge for the events that scarred his childhood. In crafting its eerie atmosphere, 1984 takes inspiration from Carpenter's minimalist style, especially his masterful use of silence and tension-building music. Carpenter's influence also appears in the stalking sequences, where Mr. Jingles quietly watches his victims before striking, mimicking Michael Myers' silent, predatory movements. Now, as I mentioned, Halloween was released in 1978, and by the time the 80s rolled around, slashers reached their zenith, giving us not just some of the most incredible films, but also some of the most iconic characters in horror history. Friday the 13th introduced Jason Voorhees, a masked killer who, like Michael Myers, was driven by a traumatic event in his past. A Nightmare on Elm Street brought Freddy Krueger into the mix, adding a supernatural twist to the genre as Freddy stalked and murdered his victims in their dreams. These characters, Jason, Freddy, and Michael, became horror icons, their images plastered on posters, merchandise, and VHS tapes across the country. Part of the reason slashers grew to such great heights has to do with the economic and cultural landscape of the time. The 80s were marked by excess, big fashion, big hair, and big spectacles, and slasher films fit right into this trend. They were over the top, gory, and sensational, reflecting the larger-than-life mentality of the decade. Additionally, the rise of home video allowed these films to reach even wider audiences. Teens could rent them on VHS, have sleepovers, and scare themselves silly in the comfort of their own homes. The slasher films of the 80s didn't just exist in isolation. They laid the foundation for future horror movies. Before the 1984 season of American Horror Story even aired, a teaser featuring a girl being murdered on a lake immediately drew comparisons to the iconic twist ending in Friday the 13th. The 1984 season and Friday the 13th share a picturesque lakeside setting where the atrocities take place. But Camp Crystal Lake was not the only inspiration for 1984. Sleepaway Camp and Camp Arawak have fingerprints all over this season. I'm gonna talk about both films, but let's start with Friday the 13th. This quintessential slasher film cemented many of the genre's conventions, including the final girl trope, brutal murders, and a relentless killer. Set at Camp Crystal Lake, the movie follows teenage counselors being systematically killed by an unseen assailant. The film's shocking twist reveals that the killer is not a masked maniac as expected, but Pamela Voorhees, a grieving mother seeking revenge for her son Jason's drowning. This focus on a mother's vengeance is echoed in 1984 through the backstory of Mr. Jingles, whose own violent actions are driven by the guilt and trauma inflicted by his mother, who blamed him for the accidental death of his brother. As the season progresses, Mr. Jingles' death is particularly notable. He experiences these flashbacks to when he was a child at Camp Redwood, and that's when we see a young Mr. Jingles, a horn dog idiot, spying on a couple doing the nasty. And Mr. Jingles faced dire consequences when he left his little brother Bobby unsupervised, and he was then decapitated by a boat. It was actually the lifeguard's fault. They were too distracted to pay attention to this kid getting his head ripped off. Mr. Jingles' mother, however, leaned more towards the former, blaming her Benny Boy Jingles for the death of Bobby. Her mourning quickly turned into extreme vengeance, deeply scarring Mr. Jingles and shaping his future. The death of Mr. Jingles' brother, how it occurs, is almost exactly the same as the opening death scene in Sleepaway Camp, with the combination of a boat and a lack of paying attention, causing a gruesome death. Sleepaway Camp is a classic summer camp slasher that brings its own edge to the genre. The story centers on Angela, a quiet, withdrawn teenager sent to Camp Arawak with her cousin Ricky. Right from the start, Angela stands out, becoming the target of bullying from campers and counselors alike. Just when it seems like camp life couldn't get any worse for her, the atmosphere turns dark as campers and staff start turning up dead in mysterious, brutal ways. The cheery camp backdrop filled with sunny skies and cabins is very reminiscent of Camp Redwood, as is the increasingly violent events that occur. What makes Sleepaway Camp memorable isn't just the kills, although they're creative and fun and add plenty of shock to the story, but the way the film keeps viewers guessing about Angela. There's a mysteriousness to her character that builds throughout the film, as subtle hints point to a deeper story behind her silent demeanor. Then there is the twist. Angela, the seemingly innocent, bullied outsider, is revealed to be the true monster of the story. This revelation turns the entire film on its head, exposing the quiet, shy girl as the source of all terror that's unfolded at Camp Arawak. It's a shocking transformation that doesn't just add surprise, but completely redefines Angela's character, suggesting that beneath her silence and vulnerability was a deadly force all along. Sound familiar? Like Angela, Margaret presents herself as an outsider shaped by trauma, initially coming across as meek and devout. However, this facade hides a brutal, twisted nature beneath, turning her into the unexpected source of terror within the story. Both Angela and Margaret twist the perception of innocence into something deadly, reminding audiences that the real threat can sometimes come where we least expect it. And it's no surprise that another influential slasher, in my opinion, I would say this is the most influential slasher of all time, inspired the 1984 season as well. I'm talking about the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, of course. Directed by Tobe Hooper, the film follows a group of friends who stumble into the heart of Texas, only to encounter a family of cannibalistic killers led by the iconic Leatherface. From its gritty, almost documentary-style cinematography to its disturbing use of sound, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre makes horror feel uncomfortably real. There's nothing polished or safe here. It's a plunge straight into terror, one that feels as brutal as it does unfiltered. I just put out a video talking about my favorite horror films, and spoiler alert, Texas Chainsaw was one of them. And I feel like it's Groundhog's Day talking about the film. I apologize if it feels that way for you too if you watched that video as well. Don't worry though, I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Anyways, Tobe Hooper's direction gives the film a sense of realism that was groundbreaking for horror at the time. The violence, though not as explicit as later films might suggest, is presented in a way that feels visceral and unescapable. The frenzied chase scenes and unsettling close-ups of Leatherface and his twisted family create an atmosphere of claustrophobia and dread. What's especially effective is how the film builds tension through a constant sense of unpredictability. Viewers feel just as vulnerable as the characters, with no idea of what horror lies around each corner, or if anyone will make it out alive. There's a very clear and direct nod to the film during the gas station scene in 1984. The stop at the gas station before the horror begins is sort of a slasher trope in itself, but that's neither here nor there. This scene was so similar to Texas Chainsaw Massacre, even the shot of the gas station attendant was nearly identical. We cannot talk about slashers of the 80s without talking about Nightmare on Elm Street, a film that merged the slasher genre with the surreal world of dreams. The film centers on a group of teenagers who begin experiencing terrifying nightmares featuring Freddy Krueger, a burned, sadistic figure with knives for fingers. Unlike the killers in most slasher films, Freddy isn't limited to the physical world, and again, I declare that the second film is moot, or at least that scene in the sequel where Freddy is frolicking through the pool party in the real world and breaks through the fence. I think I'm remembering that scene correctly. Either way, it's not canon to me, it doesn't exist, because quite simply, it makes no fucking sense. Freddy taunts his victims using their fears against them in twisted ways and attacks his victims in their dreams, making the horror far more personal and inescapable. If they fall asleep, they are vulnerable. This concept immediately set Nightmare on Elm Street apart. The character of Freddy Krueger, where to even start? He brings a distinct personality and a dark humor that was rare for villains in slasher films. I think of him as almost the Dracula of the slashers, and what I mean by that is that Dracula was a fully fledged out character compared to other Universal monsters at the time. His character was more well-rounded, it had more depth, and I believe that's why the Dracula vampire-like character has endured over the years. In the case of slasher films, unlike the silent masked killers popular in previous slasher films, Freddy has a voice both literally and figuratively, and he uses it to haunt his victims long before he strikes. This sadistic playfulness made him a unique and terrifying presence, and he seemed to take genuine pleasure in torturing his victims mentally before finishing them off. What made Freddy truly groundbreaking, though, was his supernatural nature. Unlike the killers before him, at least at the time of release, I know later films have turned killers into more supernatural beings like Michael Myers, Freddy wasn't bound by the physical laws of reality. He existed in a realm where he could defy logic, turning dreams into deadly traps that no amount of strength or skill could escape. By making Freddy a supernatural force, A Nightmare on Elm Street brought a new element to slashers. The idea that horror could follow you anywhere, even into your mind. The supernaturalness of it all is mirrored in the character Richard Ramirez in the 1984 season, but in a way that's more subtle and psychological rather than straight up imitation. Like Freddy, Ramirez doesn't just go for the kill, he really enjoys messing with people's minds. He gets this twisted satisfaction from taunting and terrorizing his victims, almost like their fear is a reward for him. Like I said, that's one of Freddy's signature moves too. He doesn't just attack, he plays with victims, making the whole experience of fear as brutal as the violence itself. The 1984 season amps up Ramirez's satanic obsession, framing him as a semi-invincible figure linked to a dark power. So, like Freddy, he isn't bound by the usual human limitations. And then there's the way both characters linger in the background, casting a shadow even when they're not on screen. Freddy's victims feel his presence before they even fall asleep. He's haunting them during the day, creeping into their minds. Ramirez, in American Horror Story, has that same effect. He's this looming figure that everyone's aware of, and his reputation is just as intimidating as his actual presence. In both cases, it's not just about the immediate threat, but about this sense of evil that's always hanging around ready to strike, making everything feel like a waking nightmare. Aside from the major slasher films, 1984 also pulls from a variety of other horror films that subtly shape its themes and aesthetic. One such influence is the 1972 Spanish film The Blood-Spattered Bride, which is referenced in the episode where Brooke Thompson's fiancé is shot on their wedding day. This scene, where her white wedding dress is covered in blood, mirrors a similar visual motif from The Blood-Spattered Bride. While not necessarily an 80s film, 1984's first episode directly mirrors the film I Know What You Did Last Summer, specifically the scene when they're driving to Camp Redwood and hit a man in the road accidentally, but then deny any involvement. Additionally, Carrie plays a key role in shaping 1984. Margaret Booth, the religiously obsessed and vengeful camp owner, is modeled after Margaret White, the fanatically strict mother in Carrie. Both Carrie and 1984 explore the connection between repression and violent outbursts, with Margaret's extreme betrayal and hidden psychopathy, which drives much of the horror at Camp Redwood. The season not only referenced classic slasher films, but also incorporated the bold and fabulous fashion of the era, the energetic music, and the complex societal themes, creating a love letter of sorts, not just to slasher films or the horror genre, but to the 1980s as a whole. The series balances nostalgia with horror, reminding us that beneath the bitchin' tunes and bright colors, there existed a darkness that profoundly shaped the era. But isn't that what horror is all about? Taking something familiar, something that feels safe, and turning it on its head? Whether it's a summer camp, a suburban home, or the bustling city streets, the 80s showed us that fear can lurk just around the corner. So as you journey through the 1984 season of American Horror Story, immerse yourself in the vibrant chaos of the decade. The neon lights, the slasher tropes, and the unmistakable 80s nostalgia. But don't get too comfortable. Beneath the surface lies a darker reality, one where the horrors of the era aren't just confined to fiction. The show brilliantly blurs the lines between the fun and the frightening, capturing the very essence of a generation where fear often felt closer than it should. The ride may be nostalgic, but the lingering unease will remind you the past isn't always as carefree as it seems.